This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Bloomburrow, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Bloomburrow limited set review. So far I've looked at all the non-mono green cards in the set, and today we're rounding things out with a look at the green ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with the letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what the letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about draft and sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play boosters in this set do have special guests, but I'll be covering those in the next video. These are also my evaluations of these cards before playing with them, and since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, that of course means I'm going to be wrong about some things, but I'll be updating my thoughts on the format here on the channel as it comes into focus. Lastly, I want to remind you that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the green cards in Bloomburrow. First up, we have Baker's Bane Duo, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 squirrel raccoon at common. When it enters, you make a food token, and whenever you expend 4, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and you expend 4 as you spend your 4 total mana to cast spells during a turn. A 2-mana 2/2 that makes food is already a nice little card, and this is also likely to be a 3/3 at times in the mid-game. This is another one of these duos that really supports 2 different decks in a really basic way. The squirrel deck likes it when you have food, and the raccoon deck likes it when you expend. So it's also a nice little synergy piece that will work in either of those decks really well, and it probably will be one of the better 2-drops for those decks, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bark Knuckle Boxer, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/2 Raccoon Berserker at uncommon, and whenever you expend 4, it gains Indestructible until end of turn. This is a nice aggressive stat line, and if you drop it on 2, it'll often be indestructible on turn 4 and beyond, and an indestructible 3/2 is a serious problem. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Brambleguard Veteran, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 Raccoon Warrior at uncommon, and whenever you expend 4, raccoons you control get +1/+1 and gain Vigilance until end of turn. This has some nice stats, and even if it was only buffing itself to a 4/5 Vigilance every time you expend it, it would be a card I like, but it will also buff all of your other raccoons and give them Vigilance too, which is amazing, giving this a B. Next up, it's Bushy Bodyguard, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/1 Squirrel Warrior at uncommon. It's got Offspring for 2 generic, and that means you can pay that additional cost when you cast it, and if you do, you make a 1/1 token copy of it. When this creature enters, you may forage. If you do, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and to forage, you exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. Running this out on 2 won't feel very good. Ideally, you're going to want to wait until you can either forage or offspring, or better yet, both. Once you're doing that, it becomes super efficient for the cost, and while it's not great on 2, it is nice that it can be a mediocre curve filler when you need it to be, and if you can drop it on 4 and do all the things it asks of you, you end up spending 4 mana for a 4/3 and a 3/3, and that's not entirely far-fetched for the mid to late game, but you do have to account for how medium, or worse really, it is in the early game, so I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, it's Cash Grab. For 1 generic and a green, it's a common instant. Mill 4 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you control a squirrel, or return a squirrel card to your hand this way, create a food token. If you're always making a food with this, it'll feel pretty amazing, and even if you can't, this card looks really nice, especially for the black-green deck. That deck likes cards in graveyards, and it likes cards that make food, and this can do both. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Cliff Top Lookout, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/2 Frog Scout at uncommon with Reach. When it enters, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this adds to the board while ramping your mana, and while its small body is unlikely to generate a full-on 2-for-1, it's pretty close to that good. It also has a useful creature type, and it's not a bad frog to blink to rebuy its into the battlefield abilities. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Curious Forager, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 Squirrel Druid at uncommon. When it enters, you can forage, and when you do, you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. You'll be able to get this into the battlefield trigger pretty often. However, you also need stuff in the graveyard for it to matter. That's not a huge ask, but it does effectively ask you to jump through 2 hoops to get the big value here. And if you don't go the food sacrifice route, it's going to be even harder for you to get something back. Still, the upside is real, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Druid of the Spade, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 rabbit druid at common. As long as you control a token, it gets +2/+0 and has trample. This will be a 4/3 trampler a decent chunk of the time in this set, since it counts creature tokens as well as food, but a card that's always a 3 mana 4/3 trampler isn't an insane ceiling, and the floor is pretty bad here, so I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Fecund Greenshell, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a rare elemental turtle with reach. As long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2, and whenever it or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you can put it on the battlefield tapped, otherwise put it into your hand. A 5 mana 4/6 with reach that draws you a card on ETB is awesome, and this is so much more than that. For one thing, if your top card's a land, it just puts it into play. For another, you get this trigger anytime a high toughness creature comes down, and for another still, it will offer an insane buff to the whole board by the late game. This is good no matter when you play it. It has potential value engine upside and potential to break a game wide open too. It's a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's For the Common Good, which for XX green is a rare sorcery. Create X tokens that are copies of target token you control. Then tokens you control gain indestructible until your next turn. You gain 1 life for each token you control. This set has a lot of tokens, including in green, and if you're copying an Offspring, this can get particularly spicy since those tokens tend to have some big upside. The life and indestructibility are likely to help you survive until the next turn so you can use all those tokens too. That said, it is pretty mana intensive. Paying 5 for 2 token copies, for example, is going to be really underwhelming, even with most of the Offspring. And then there will also be times where you just don't have tokens, and that's a nightmare. I think this is just a C overall. It has a nice ceiling, but an awful floor. Next up, it's Galewind Moose, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 elemental elk at uncommon. It has flash, vigilance, reach, and trample. I like this. It may just be a big old French vanilla creature, but flash on a big creature is pretty great because you can generate 2-for-1s with it, since it can come down and ambush block so effectively. Then its other keywords all work really well together with its massive size, giving it a B. Next up, it's Hazard Root Herbalist, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 rabbit druid at uncommon. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If that creature is a token, it also gains Death Touch until end of turn. So it doesn't matter what you attack with. That means the turn this comes down, if you played in your first main phase, you will get this buff right away during combat on your turn. And it can also buff itself, although obviously it won't be doing that the turn it comes down. Giving a token +1/+0 in Death Touch is where the most value is, as turning a token, something that's supposed to be worth less than a card, into something your opponent just can't block without giving something up is a really big upgrade. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Heaped Harvest, which for 2 generic and a green is a common artifact food. When it enters and when you sacrifice it, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. You can pay 2 generic and tap it and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. This is interesting. In the end, you can spend 5 total mana to search up 2 basic lands and gain 3 life. If you're really going hard on ramp, that seems pretty good. The life gain helps you survive long enough to take advantage of the ramp. The problem is, this format doesn't have a big ramp theme or a big multicolor theme, so doing this sort of thing isn't super appealing. You can sack it to Forage, in which case you can get 2 lands for only 3 mana, but I'm still skeptical that's something you really need to be doing in the format. I'm going to start it at a C-. Next up, it's High Stride, which for 1 green mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +1/+3 and gains reach until end of turn, untap it. We see this kind of trick all the time, and it's almost always pretty mediocre. It's cheap, which is often important for a good trick, but only buffing a creature's power by 1 makes it so that it allows a smaller number of creatures to win combat, and spending a trick just to save your creature in combat isn't worth it because it's card disadvantage. Then the untap and reach parts are always awkward too, because it is super dangerous to use tricks during your opponent's turn. This is because they're more likely to have mana available and be able to interact during combat on their turn than on your turn, so having 2 effects that are largely defensive and trying to use this to ambush block something is incredibly dangerous. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Hive Spine Wolverine, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/4 elemental Wolverine at uncommon. When it enters, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Hive Spine Wolverine fights target creature token, or destroy target artifact or enchantment. This looks great. You get the most value out of the fight effect, and adding this 5/4 to the board and killing like a 3/3 is going to feel great, but when that mode isn't useful, it does give you a couple of other attractive choices. When it has a target to destroy, that'll feel great. And while getting a counter is less exciting, we're still talking about a 5-mana 5/4 that can put a counter somewhere, and it can't even put it on itself, and that's the fail case. This is going to have a way bigger impact than that most of the time. Mix in the fact that blue-green can abuse Enter the Battlefield abilities in this set, and I think we're talking about a B+. Next up, it's Honored Dray Leader, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/1 Squirrel Warrior at uncommon. It's got Trample. When it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other squirrel and or food you control. Whenever another squirrel or food you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on Honored Dray Leader. I always like it when synergy pieces trigger based on what you've already done and on what you're going to do in the future. It means that this is likely to grow no matter what, and it has real potential to be absolutely massive. The card's baseline is awful as a 3-mana 1/1, but if you're in black-green, it's never going to be a 3-mana 1/1. So I think this card looks really great. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Hunter's Talent, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment class. When it enters, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, and then because it has level up, you can pay costs to level it up and add additional effects. You can take it to level 2 for 1 generic and a green, and then whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. Level 3 is 3 generic and a green, and at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. So this gives you Rabid Bite up front, and that's like a C+ level card, and unlocking the other modes later in the game is a really relevant cherry on top. Level 2 can make a creature of any size much more problematic, and level 3 is likely to draw you cards by the time you get there. Sometimes you can combine level 2 and level 3 to draw a card, like if you buff a 3-power creature and attack with it and your opponent doesn't kill it, level 3 will trigger. So this can end up drawing you a bunch of cards after being a really good removal spell early. This just looks like an amazing uncommon, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Innkeeper's Talent, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare enchantment class. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. You can take it to level 2 for 1 green, and permanents you control with counters on them have ward 1, and you can take it to level 3 for 3 generic and a green, and if you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. So, the base form of Innkeeper's Talent is a great card. Getting a free counter every turn can quickly snowball, and it gives you one right away if you play it in your first main phase. The other levels are nice, and level 2 only costing a single green makes it hurt a little less that it's not that good, but once you get to level 3, that will obviously upgrade level 1 to the point where you're getting 2 counters every turn, which is a huge deal. Like, I honestly think if this was just 1 generic and a green for a card that put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control every turn, if that's all it was without ever being able to level up, it would be at least a B, and then it has some pretty significant additional upside that I think puts it in the bomb range, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Keen-Eyed Curator, which for 2 green is a 3/3 Raccoon Scout at rare. As long as there are 4 or more card types among cards exiled with Keen-Eyed Curator, it gets +4/+4 and has Trample, and you can pay 1 generic and exile a card from a graveyard. Playing this on turn 2 is a bit tricky and limited, so its baseline efficiency does take a bit of a hit, but luckily a 3/3 is formidable all game long. It's nice in the late game that he has this weird Exile Delirium thing going on where he can become a 7/7, which is very obviously a great deal, but it does always take setup, and the cards that are exiled have to be exiled by the Curator, and you and your opponent may never have enough different card types for it to matter. But it is a graveyard hate tool in a format where it matters. It's also an efficient creature, and then it does occasionally have this upside where it becomes a real threat. I think it's a B-. Next up, it's Longstock Brawl, which is a common sorcery for 1 green. It says gift a tapped fish, and that means when you cast it, you can offer your opponent a gift, and if you do, they create a tapped 1/1 blue fish creature token before its other effects. Choose target creature you control, and target creature you don't control. Put a +1/+1 counter on the creature you control if the gift was promised, then those creatures fight each other. So this is Prey Upon when you don't give your opponent a gift, and way better than Prey Upon when you do. Because the fish is tapped, this is an attractive option to choose in a situation where it lets you kill your opponent's only blocker and attack really hard. Still, there are many situations where handing your opponent a 1/1 is a bad idea. This effectively becomes a removal spell that doesn't give you a full card worth of value in those spots, and it has all the usual risks associated with fights. I think that holds it to a C. Next up, it's Lumra, Bellow of the Woods, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a star legendary elemental bear at mythic rare. It's got vigilance and reach. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control, and when it enters, you mill 4 cards, then return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is going to be a huge creature, usually significantly larger than 6/6 when you cast it, and it gets better if you have some graveyard action in your deck. Still in limited, this mostly amounts to being a big French vanilla creature. That's certainly not bad, but it's no bomb either. I think it compares pretty similarly to the Moose in limited. I think it's just a B. Next up, it's Mist Breath Elder. For 1 green mana, it's a 2/2 Frog Warrior at rare. At the beginning of your upkeep, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on Mist Breach Elder. Otherwise, you may return Mist Breach Elder to its owner's hand. So the effect here is pretty weird and hard to parse at first, but it's basically this. If you have another creature in play on your upkeep, you have to return it, but if the Elder is your only creature, you don't have to return it. Anyway, the potential here is really high, as growing the Elder and rebuying Enter the Battlefield abilities is pretty insane for a card that only costs a single mana. It is true that you won't always have other creatures worth returning, and sometimes things will get awkward, but blue-green especially has so many good Enter the Battlefield abilities, even at lower rarities and mana values, that I don't think getting this going will be that hard. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Overprotect, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. Target creature you control gets +3/+3 and gains trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. Oh god, this card is going to be a real pain to play against. It's kind of like a green version of Take Up the Shield, a trick that is always great. This doesn't offer a permanent boost or lifelink, but it more than makes up for that since it gives a way bigger boost in trample. This will win you combat almost 100% of the time, and it also blanks most removal. You also throw freaking trample in, which gives it the upside of doing tons of damage out of nowhere. This trick is so strong that I think you're going to value it really highly in most green decks. I'm giving it a B-, a grade that I only very rarely give to combat tricks, but this one's the real deal. Next up, it's Paw Patch Formation, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. It says choose 1, destroy target creature with flying, destroy target enchantment, draw a card, create a food token. So the make a food, draw a card mode is always going to be available, and it's okay. And this has some nice added utility. I think you'll run one of these in a lot of green decks and be pretty happy that you have some main deck hate for some things that you're probably going to encounter, giving it a C. Next up, it's Paw Patch Recruit, which for 1 green mana is a 2/1 rare rabbit warrior with offspring for 2 generic. It's got trample, and whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. You do need another creature in play for this to trigger, so if you play this on an empty board, it just dies and nothing happens. However, as long as you've got at least one other creature around, the Recruit makes sure you get value anytime your opponent uses removal, and obviously enough offspring means that they won't ever be alone, and you'll get 2 counters when one of them gets targeted. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Peerless Recycling, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon instant with gift a card. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand if the gift was promised. Instead, return 2 target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. 2 mana for 2 permanents is pretty strong, and while this definitely gets weakened by the fact that you have to give your opponent a card, as with most of these gift a card effects, you're likely the one coming out ahead because the permanent you get is going to be better than a random card out of your opponent's deck in most cases, and if you're in a spot where you can't really afford to give them a card or you can't get 2 things back, it's still regrowth. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Polywallop, which for 3 generic and a green is a common instant. It costs 1 generic less to cast for each frog you control. Target creature you control deals damage equal to twice its power to target creature you don't control. This allows a medium-sized creature to take down pretty much anything, and reducing the cost on it isn't too hard, especially in blue-green. If you pay 3 or less on this, it'll feel amazing, and I think you'll do that often enough for this to be a B-. Next up, it's Rust Shield Rampager, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 Raccoon Warrior at common with offspring for 2 generic, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. This kind of evasion is surprisingly useful, as sometimes it makes your creature straight up unblockable, and it usually at least makes it so it can't be chump blocked. That evasion is less good on the offspring, but it also doesn't hurt. It's also a raccoon that costs 4, which gives you some bonus points in this format, because it's a raccoon that triggers expend all on its own. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Scrap Shooter, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 Raccoon Archer at rare with gift a card. It's got reach, and when it enters, if the gift was promised, destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. A 3 mana 4/4 reach is pretty beefy, and that's what this is going to be most of the time. You're only ever going to give your opponent the gift if they have a really scary artifact or enchantment in play, but it is nice to have that upside. Still, this is mostly just an above-rate creature with a medium keyword. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Season of Gathering, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery. Choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. For 1 paw print, you can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. It gains Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. For 2 paw prints, you can choose an artifact or enchantment and destroy all permanents of the chosen type. And for 3 paw prints, you can draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Choosing the first mode twice and the third mode once will often be the way to go here, since it's likely you augment your board and draw a bunch of cards. Sometimes going with the first mode 5 times will win you the game though, and other times taking down enchantments and or artifacts will be worth doing. I wish it added to the board all on its own in a more significant way, like making a 3/3 token or something, because as it is, it won't always do enough to improve your board state. You kind of need something going on or it doesn't do what it needs to, but it still looks really good, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Sticky Tongue Sentinel, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 Frog Warrior at common. It's got reach, and when it enters, return up to 1 other target permanent you control to its owner's hand. 3 mana for a 3/3 with reach is like a C-, and green has ways to take advantage of bouncing stuff, so I think this is a C. Next up, it's Stalking the Pantry, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, put a supply counter on Stalking the Pantry. For 2 generic, you can remove a supply counter from it to draw a card. This looks pretty bad. First, counters are around in this set, but they aren't a massive theme. There isn't a counter deck, for example. That means getting this going at all isn't very easy, and drawing a card for 2 mana for every 2 instances of counters you put on things isn't that good to begin with. This is the kind of card where if you play it on turn 1, you'll feel like you mulliganed a lot of the time. I think this is unplayable, giving it an F. Next up, it's Sunshower Druid, which for 1 green mana is a 0/2 Frog Druid at common. When it enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and you gain 1 life. This feels like one of those 1-drops that does so much for so little that it's going to be pretty good. At worst, it's a 1 mana 1/3 that gains you 1. That's a solid turn 1 play. The set has synergy for this creature type, and it's another creature that you can blink over and over again for value. And later in the game, it's not bad either, because you can put the counter somewhere where it's really relevant. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Tender Wild Guide, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Possum Druid at rare. It's got Offspring for 2 generic. It can tap for 1 mana of any color, and it can tap to put +1/+1 counters on itself. If this didn't have Offspring, it would be a great card. A 2 mana Mana Dork is amazing, and this has tons of utility thanks to its ability to grow itself. Throw in Offspring, and we're certainly talking about a bomb, one that gives you 2 bodies, ramps your mana in a big way, and can threaten to give you 2 big creatures in the long run, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Thorn Vault Forager, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Squirrel Ranger at rare. It can tap for green. You can tap it and forage to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. You can pay 3 generic and a green and tap it to search your library for a squirrel card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. A 2 mana 2/2 that taps for green is good, and sometimes this will be able to ramp your mana even more, even in the early game if you have some food around. Searching up squirrels late is going to be a great mana sink too, as it's the kind of thing that can make sure you stay in decent shape even if you're flooding out, giving it a B+. Next up, it's 3 Tree Root Weaver, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 Mole Druid at common, and it can tap for 1 mana of any color. This looks pretty sad after the other 2 drops we just saw that can tap for mana, but they were both rare. This is still pretty good. The 1/3 stat line helps it remain at least relevant all game, and if you drop it on 2, it can give you a great start and fix your mana, giving it a C+. Next up, it's 3 Tree Scribe, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon Frog Druid. When it or another creature you control leaves the battlefield without dying, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this is worded this way so that if your creature gets blinked or bounced to your hand, you get a counter. It does also work if your opponent exiles something with removal, so that's some additional upside that will come up sometimes. It's also got above rate stats, which is nice, and it kind of pays you off for doing the thing that the blue-green deck wants you to be doing. I am a little skeptical about that deck. We have very rarely seen blink decks actually pan out in limited, but this is a pretty pushed card for that style of deck, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Tree Guard Duo, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/4 Frog Rabbit at common. When it enters, until end of turn, target creature you control gains Vigilance and gets +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is a frog that has an enter the battlefield ability, so it checks that, and it's a rabbit that likes it when you go wide, and that's what the green-white theme is. And this enter the battlefield ability will always give at least +2/+2 in Vigilance because it counts itself and whatever you're targeting, and that's not too shabby as a fail case, and there will be times where it offers a huge buff on a Trampler or a Flyer or something, giving it a C. Next up, it's Treetop Sentries, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/4 Squirrel Archer at common with reach. When it enters, you can forage, and if you do, you draw a card. If you're not drawing a card with this, It's pretty bad. You just can't play a 4-mana 2/4 with Reach anymore and hope things will be okay. When you do draw a card with it though, it's like a B because it suddenly becomes a 2-for-1. I think there's enough support for foraging for this to do its thing often enough for it to be a C+. Next up, it's Valley Mightcaller, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 frog warrior at rare. It's got trample, and whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on Valley Mightcaller. If you're in green and you drop this on 1, it's going to grow throughout the game, and usually in a big way. It's not great when you draw it in the mid to late game though, as at that point it's less likely to continue to grow. It does work with all the blink stuff frogs are doing, which I guess is nice, but I think this is just a B-. Great in the early game, but not so good later. And our last card is Wear Down, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery with gift a card. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. If the gift was promised, instead destroy 2 artifacts and or enchantments. It takes a very specific format for a sorcery speed naturalized to be worth playing in your main deck, and I don't think this is one of them, even with the upside of sometimes destroying 2 of them. It is true that if you're destroying an artifact or enchantment on board, especially a problematic one, that is probably worth giving your opponent the card, but I just don't see it coming up that much. I think this is a sideboard C. So those are all the green cards in Bloomburrow. All we've got left now are the special guests and 1 card that I missed earlier in the week. And we'll be looking at all those things in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch the next video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the rest of this set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.